When a devastating tornado forced Harold Morrison to offer emergency shelter to a stranded federal archivist at his failing Kentucky farm, he had no idea that this act of kindness would lead to discovering classified World War II documents hidden in his father's barn, documents worth $47 million to the U.S. government and missing for 78 years, transforming a bankrupt farmer facing foreclosure into the guardian of America's most significant wartime intelligence discovery, with FBI agents now permanently stationed on his property. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know what state you're watching from in the comments, and if this story gives you chills, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow, we've got another mind-blowing story about a librarian who found a hidden vault in her basement that contained stolen presidential artifacts worth $23 million. At 68 years old, Harold Morrison was staring at foreclosure papers from First National Bank of Henderson County that represented the mathematical impossibility of saving 4 generations of family farming legacy as he sat in his sagging farmhouse kitchen on a sweltering August morning in 2024, surrounded by past due notices from equipment loan companies, overdue property tax bills totaling $47,000, and a final demand from Kentucky Farm Credit that would seize his 180-acre tobacco and corn farm in exactly 21 days if he couldn't produce the $127. A return he didn't have and couldn't possibly raise in time to prevent his family from losing everything his great-grandfather had built when he first settled this Henderson County land in 1894. The certified letter from First National lay open beside his morning coffee like a death sentence for everything 4 generations of Morrison men had sacrificed to build. Its corporate language reducing 130 years of family heritage and backbreaking agricultural work to a series of missed mortgage payments. And legal procedures. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. The header declared in bold red letters, followed by the devastating mathematics of modern farming: $89,000 to $400 in accumulated mortgage debt, $23,600 in unpaid equipment loans, $14,000 in overdue property taxes, and exactly 21 days to somehow produce money that Harold knew he didn't have, while also covering the operating expenses for maintaining 180 acres of tobacco and corn crops that might not generate sufficient revenue to cover basic farming costs. Harold's modest 2-story farmhouse, built by his grandfather in 1923, sat like a weathered monument to American agricultural heritage in the rolling hills of Henderson County, Kentucky, where 5 generations of Morrison families had raised tobacco, corn, and livestock on land that had been productive and profitable until the combination of declining tobacco markets, rising equipment costs, and devastating weather patterns had made small-scale farming economically unsustainable for independent operators competing against corporate agricultural giants with unlimited resources and government subsidies. The 180-acre farm that Harold had inherited from his father represented not just property and agricultural assets, but the accumulated labor and dreams of 4 generations of Morrison men who had transformed raw Kentucky wilderness into productive agricultural land through decades of manual labor, careful stewardship, and agricultural innovation that had sustained their family while contributing to Kentucky's agricultural economy and rural community development throughout the 20th century. The Morrison family name was respected throughout Henderson County, not just for their agricultural expertise, but for their unwavering commitment to their land, their neighbors, and the traditional values that had built rural Kentucky's farming communities during the most challenging periods of American agricultural history. Harold's great-grandfather, Thomas Morrison, had arrived in Henderson County in 1894 with nothing but a horse, a wagon, and the determination to build something lasting for his family on the fertile Kentucky soil that reminded him of his childhood home in rural Tennessee. Thomas had purchased the initial 80 acres for $320 in cash that represented his entire life savings, then spent the next 30 years clearing forests, building the original farmhouse, and establishing the tobacco and corn operations that would sustain 4 generations of Morrison families through economic depressions, world wars, and agricultural transformations that had destroyed many other family farming operations throughout Kentucky and the broader American South. The farmhouse that Thomas Morrison had constructed in 1895 had been expanded and improved by each subsequent generation, with Harold's grandfather adding the second story and modern plumbing in 1923. Harold's father installing electricity and central heating in 1967, and Harold himself adding insulation and energy-efficient windows during the 1990s when tobacco prices had provided sufficient income for home improvements that reflected the family's commitment to maintaining their property and preserving their agricultural heritage for future generations of Morrison farmers. But the agricultural economics that had sustained the Morrison farm for 4 generations had been systematically destroyed by market changes, regulatory requirements, and corporate competition that made small-scale farming increasingly impossible, despite Harold's agricultural expertise and his decades of experience managing tobacco cultivation, livestock operations, and crop rotation systems that had been environmentally sustainable and economically viable, until global market forces eliminated profitability for independent farmers who lacked the resources to compete with industrial agricultural operations. The tobacco markets that had been the foundation of Kentucky agricultural prosperity for over a century had been devastated by declining demand, regulatory restrictions, and international competition that had reduced prices below production costs, while increasing compliance requirements that small farmers couldn't afford to implement. Harold's tobacco crops, which had generated $45,000 to $60,000 annually during the 1990s and early 2000s, were now producing less than $18,000 yearly, while requiring the same equipment, labor, and infrastructure investments that had been profitable when tobacco prices were substantially higher, and federal price support programs had provided stability for Kentucky farmers. The corn and soybean crops that Harold had planted as diversification strategies were generating minimal revenue due to corporate agricultural competition and commodity prices that had been suppressed by international trade policies and industrial farming operations that could produce crops at costs that independent farmers couldn't match. Harold's 80 acres of corn were generating approximately $400 per acre annually, while his production costs were exceeding $380 per acre, creating profit margins of less than $20 per acre that couldn't support equipment maintenance, property taxes, or basic living expenses for a family that had depended on agricultural income for their survival and economic security. The soybean crops that Harold had attempted as an additional revenue source were producing even smaller profit margins, with market prices that had declined substantially due to international trade disputes and corporate farming operations that could achieve economies of scale that individual farmers could never match. The 60 acres that Harold had dedicated to soybeans were generating less than $15 per acre in profit after accounting for seed costs, equipment expenses, fuel consumption, and the labor required for planting, cultivation, and harvesting operations that consumed substantial time and resources while producing minimal financial returns. The equipment loans that were consuming Harold's limited resources reflected the impossible trap that modern farming had created for independent operators who needed expensive machinery to remain competitive, but couldn't generate sufficient revenue to justify the loan payments required for purchasing or maintaining contemporary agricultural equipment. Harold's 1998 John Deere tractor, his 2003 tobacco harvester, and his 2007 corn planter represented over $180,000 in equipment debt that required monthly payments of $2,400 while generating insufficient revenue to cover both equipment costs and basic farming expenses that were essential for maintaining agricultural operations. The John Deere tractor that had been purchased in 1998 for $67,000 was still functional but required increasingly expensive maintenance and repairs that consumed thousands of dollars annually, while the outstanding loan balance remained at $34,000 despite Harold's consistent payments over more than 2 decades. The tractor's mechanical reliability had declined substantially, with hydraulic system problems, transmission issues, and engine wear that created frequent breakdowns during critical farming periods when equipment failures could destroy entire crops and eliminate seasonal income that Harold's family depended upon for their survival. The tobacco harvester that Harold had purchased in 2003 represented one of his most significant financial mistakes, as the $45,000 equipment loan had been based on tobacco price projections that had proven completely inaccurate due to market changes and regulatory restrictions that had eliminated most of the economic advantages that specialized tobacco equipment was supposed to provide. The harvester now required annual maintenance costs that exceeded $8,000 while being used for operations that generated insufficient revenue to justify the equipment investment, creating a situation where Harold couldn't afford to maintain the equipment but also couldn't afford to operate without it. The corn planter that Harold had purchased in 2007, during a brief period of optimistic commodity prices, had been financed through a 7-year loan that had seemed reasonable when corn prices were substantially higher and federal agricultural policies provided more favorable conditions for independent farmers. The $38,000 equipment investment had been justified by increased planting efficiency and improved crop yields, but declining commodity prices and rising input costs had eliminated the economic advantages while leaving Harold with monthly payments that consumed a substantial portion of his limited agricultural income. Harold's personal situation had been catastrophically complicated by the medical expenses associated with his wife Margaret's cancer treatment, which had consumed their savings and created additional debt that had accelerated their financial decline, while also eliminating Margaret's emotional support and practical assistance that had been essential for managing the complex demands of agricultural operations. Margaret Morrison had been not only Harold's beloved wife of 42 years, but also his essential partner in managing farm finances, coordinating seasonal labor, and maintaining the detailed records that were required for agricultural tax compliance and equipment maintenance scheduling. Margaret's cancer diagnosis in 2020 had occurred during a period when their agricultural income was already declining due to market conditions and weather challenges, creating a situation where her medical treatment consumed resources that the family needed for basic survival, while also requiring Harold to manage farming operations without her assistance during the most physically and emotionally demanding period of their marriage. The chemotherapy treatments that Margaret had undergone from 2020 through 2022 had required weekly trips to Louisville that consumed entire days and created transportation costs that exceeded $400 monthly, while also preventing Harold from attending to essential farming activities during critical agricultural periods. The medical expenses that resulted from Margaret's cancer treatment had exceeded $67,000 despite their insurance coverage, with deductibles, co-payments, and uncovered treatments creating debt that had forced Harold to choose between his wife's medical care and maintaining agricultural operations that were essential for their family's survival. The insurance policy that Harold and Margaret had maintained through Kentucky Farm Bureau had provided basic coverage, but included substantial deductibles and limitations that made comprehensive cancer treatment financially devastating for a family whose income was already insufficient to cover basic living expenses and agricultural operating costs. Margaret's death in December 2022 had left Harold not only emotionally devastated, but completely overwhelmed by the practical and financial challenges of managing agricultural operations without her assistance, while also grieving the loss of his life partner and attempting to address debt obligations that had accumulated during her illness. Margaret's part-time teaching position at Henderson County Elementary School had provided $23,000 annually in additional income that had been essential for covering household expenses and agricultural equipment payments, creating a $23,000 annual income reduction that made Harold's financial situation completely unsustainable. The life insurance policy that Harold and Margaret had maintained through their farm insurance provider had been reduced to $15,000 due to premium payment difficulties. During Margaret's illness, providing insufficient funds to cover her medical debt while also eliminating any financial resources that could have provided Harold with time to adjust to single-person farm management or explore alternative income sources that might have made their agricultural operations economically viable without Margaret's teaching income and farm management assistance. The emotional toll of Margaret's death had affected Harold's physical and mental health in ways that made farming operations more difficult to manage effectively, with grief and depression creating sleep disruption, appetite problems, and decision-making difficulties that interfered with the careful planning and consistent daily attention that successful agricultural operations required. The social isolation that resulted from Margaret's death had been compounded by the rural location of their farm, which was located 3 miles from their nearest neighbors and 15 miles from Henderson's town center, creating situations where Harold could go days without meaningful human contact while managing the complex and physically demanding work that farming required. The property taxes that Henderson County assessed on agricultural land had increased substantially during the past decade as local governments attempted to address budget shortfalls by increasing revenue from property owners, creating tax burdens that small farmers couldn't afford despite the declining profitability of agricultural operations. Harold's annual property tax bill had increased from $8,400 in 2019 to $14,000 in 2024, representing a 67% increase that exceeded his farm's profit margins and created impossible choices between paying taxes and maintaining agricultural operations that were essential for generating the income needed to cover basic living expenses. The property tax increases had been particularly devastating because they occurred during the same period when Harold's agricultural income was declining due to market conditions and equipment problems, creating a situation where his fixed expenses were increasing while his revenue was decreasing, and his ability to generate additional income was limited by age, health challenges, and the time demands of maintaining agricultural operations. The Henderson County Tax Assessor's Office had justified the increases by citing regional property value appreciation, but had failed to consider that agricultural property values were not generating corresponding income increases for working farmers who depended on land for agricultural production rather than real estate speculation. The federal and state agricultural support programs that had sustained small farmers during previous decades had been systematically reduced or eliminated, leaving independent operators like Harold without the safety net that had made family farming economically viable during earlier periods of American agricultural development. The tobacco price support programs that had provided stability for Kentucky farmers during the mid-20th century had been eliminated, while crop insurance programs had become increasingly expensive and bureaucratic, requiring documentation and compliance procedures that consumed substantial time, while providing minimal protection against the market forces that were destroying agricultural profitability. The Farm Service Agency programs that had previously provided emergency assistance and low-interest loans for agricultural operations had become increasingly restrictive and bureaucratic, with application procedures that required extensive documentation and financial analysis that many small farmers couldn't complete without professional assistance that they couldn't afford. Harold's attempts to obtain federal agricultural assistance had been unsuccessful due to debt-to-income ratios that exceeded program guidelines and collateral requirements that were impossible to meet, given his existing equipment loans and property tax obligations. Harold's efforts to supplement his agricultural income through part-time employment had been unsuccessful due to his age, his limited experience with non-agricultural work, and the time demands of maintaining farming operations that required daily attention throughout growing seasons. The retail and service positions available in Henderson County typically paid $12 to $15 hourly and required transportation costs and time commitments that would interfere with essential farming activities while generating insufficient income to address his debt obligations or provide meaningful improvement to his financial situation. The seasonal nature of agricultural work had made it particularly difficult for Harold to find compatible employment, as farming operations required intensive daily attention during planting and harvesting periods that coincided with the times when temporary employment was most available in rural Kentucky communities. The physical demands of farming had also limited Harold's ability to pursue employment that required standing, lifting, or extended periods of physical activity, while his lack of computer skills and contemporary business experience had eliminated most office or technical positions that might have been compatible with agricultural scheduling requirements. The farm equipment that Harold owned represented substantial assets that were difficult to liquidate due to specialized agricultural applications and limited local markets for used farming machinery. His attempts to sell equipment to reduce debt had generated offers that were far below the outstanding loan balances, creating situations where equipment sales would still leave him with substantial debt while eliminating his ability to maintain agricultural operations that were essential for generating any income from his land and farming expertise. The used equipment market in Henderson County had been depressed by the same economic conditions that were affecting all small farmers, with potential buyers facing similar financial constraints and reluctant to purchase equipment that required substantial ongoing maintenance and repair costs. The specialized nature of tobacco equipment had further limited the potential market, as declining tobacco production throughout Kentucky had reduced demand for tobacco-specific machinery while increasing the supply of used equipment from farmers who were abandoning tobacco cultivation entirely. Harold's 1998 John Deere tractor had received purchase offers ranging from $18,000 to $22,000, amounts that were substantially below the $34,000 outstanding loan balance and would require Harold to pay the bank approximately $12,000 to complete the sale while eliminating his primary agricultural equipment. The tobacco harvester had generated even less interest from potential buyers, with offers of $8,000 to $12,000 for equipment that had an outstanding loan balance of $23,000, creating a situation where selling the equipment would require Harold to pay the bank over $11,000 while losing the specialized equipment that was essential for tobacco production operations. The isolation that rural farming created had become particularly challenging for Harold since Margaret's death, as their farmhouse was located on a gravel road that was 3 miles from Highway 41 and 15 miles from Henderson's town center, creating transportation costs and social isolation that compounded his financial stress while making daily logistics more expensive and time-consuming. The rural location that had been advantageous for agricultural operations was creating challenges for accessing medical care, purchasing supplies, and maintaining social connections that were essential for emotional support and practical assistance. During his crisis period, the gravel road that connected Harold's farm to Highway 41 required regular maintenance that Harold couldn't afford, with winter weather and spring rains creating road conditions that made travel difficult and sometimes impossible for standard passenger vehicles. The road maintenance costs that Harold shared with 2 other rural property owners had increased to over $2,400 annually due to gravel costs and equipment rental expenses that were essential for maintaining vehicle access to their properties, creating another fixed expense that consumed resources Harold needed for basic survival. The telephone and internet service that connected Harold's farm to essential communication systems had become increasingly unreliable and expensive, with rural telecommunications infrastructure that hadn't been updated for decades, and service interruptions that occurred frequently during weather events that were common in Kentucky. Harold's landline telephone service cost $67 monthly and frequently experienced outages during storms, while internet service was limited to satellite connections that cost $89 monthly and provided insufficient bandwidth for contemporary business, applications, or reliable communication with agricultural suppliers and government agencies. The transportation costs associated with rural farming had increased substantially as fuel prices had risen, and Harold's 2008 Ford pickup truck had required increasingly expensive maintenance and repairs. The pickup truck that Harold used for farm operations and personal transportation had accumulated over 185,000 miles and required annual maintenance costs that exceeded $4,500 while providing unreliable transportation that created constant concerns about mechanical failures during critical farming periods, or emergency situations that required immediate travel to town for supplies or medical assistance. As Harold sat in his kitchen on this August morning, calculating whether selling his remaining livestock might delay foreclosure for a few additional weeks, he was unaware that the tobacco barn he was considering renovating as a last resort income strategy contained materials that would attract the attention of federal agencies, national security officials, and historical researchers whose interest in his father Robert Morrison's legacy would exceed anything Harold had ever imagined possible about his father's seemingly conventional farming operations and community activities throughout Henderson County. The tobacco barn that Robert Morrison had renovated during the 1980s represented Harold's final hope for generating sufficient income to delay foreclosure. With the building's potential for conversion to event space, equipment storage, or agricultural processing that might attract rental income from neighboring farmers or commercial operations that needed rural storage facilities. Harold's preliminary assessment of renovation costs had indicated that basic improvements might require $15,000 to $25,000 in materials and labor, investments that he couldn't afford, but that might be justified if they could generate monthly rental income of $1,500 to $2,500 that could address his immediate debt obligations. But Harold had no idea that within days, a federal employee's emergency would bring an expert to his property who would recognize that Robert Morrison's tobacco barn contained architectural features and storage systems that would reveal he had been far more than just a successful Kentucky farmer. He had been the guardian of federal secrets that had remained hidden for over 7 decades. secrets that would save Harold's farm while contributing to America's understanding of one of the most significant wartime intelligence operations in the nation's history. The 180-acre farm that Harold had inherited from his father represented not just property and agricultural assets, but the accumulated labor and dreams of 4 generations of Morrison men who had transformed raw Kentucky wilderness into productive agricultural land through decades of manual labor, careful stewardship, and agricultural innovation that had sustained their family while contributing to Kentucky's agricultural economy and rural community development throughout the 20th century. Harold's father, Robert Morrison, had operated the farm successfully from 1967 until his death in 2019, building a reputation throughout Henderson County for producing high-quality tobacco and maintaining sustainable agricultural practices that protected soil quality while generating consistent income that had supported not only their family, but also provided employment for seasonal workers and contributed to the local agricultural economy that sustained rural Kentucky communities. But the agricultural economics that had sustained the Morrison farm for 4 generations had been systematically destroyed by market changes, regulatory requirements, and corporate competition that made small-scale farming increasingly impossible, despite Harold's agricultural expertise and his decades of experience managing tobacco, cultivation, livestock operations, and crop rotation systems that had been environmentally sustainable and economically viable until global market forces eliminated profitability for independent farmers. The tobacco markets that had been the foundation of Kentucky agricultural prosperity for over a century had been devastated by declining demand, regulatory restrictions, and international competition that had reduced prices below production costs while increasing compliance requirements that small farmers couldn't afford to implement. Harold's tobacco crops, which had generated $45,000 to $60,000 annually during the 1990s and early 2000s, were now producing less than $18,000 yearly while requiring the same equipment, labor, and infrastructure investments that had been profitable. When tobacco prices were substantially higher, the corn and soybean crops that Harold had planted as diversification strategies were generating minimal revenue due to corporate agricultural competition and commodity prices that had been suppressed by international trade policies and industrial farming operations that could produce crops at costs that independent farmers couldn't match. Harold's 80 acres of corn were generating approximately $400 per acre annually, while his production costs were exceeding $380 per acre, creating profit margins that couldn't support equipment maintenance, property taxes, or basic living expenses. The equipment loans that were consuming Harold's limited resources reflected the impossible trap that modern farming had created for independent operators who needed expensive machinery to remain competitive, but couldn't generate sufficient revenue to justify the loan payments required for purchasing or maintaining contemporary agricultural equipment. Harold's 1998 John Deere tractor, his 2003 tobacco harvester, and his 2007 corn planter represented over $180,000 in equipment debt that required monthly payments of $2,400 while generating insufficient revenue to cover both equipment costs and basic farming expenses. Harold's personal situation had been complicated by the medical expenses associated with his wife Margaret's cancer treatment, which had consumed their savings and created additional debt that had accelerated their financial decline. Margaret's death in 2022 had left Harold not only emotionally devastated, but financially overwhelmed by medical bills that exceeded $67,000 despite their insurance coverage, while also eliminating Margaret's income from her part-time teaching position. that had provided $23,000 annually and had been essential for covering their basic living expenses. The property taxes that Henderson County assessed on agricultural land had increased substantially during the past decade as local governments attempted to address budget shortfalls by increasing revenue from property owners, creating tax burdens that small farmers couldn't afford, despite the declining profitability of agricultural operations. Harold's annual property tax bill had increased from $8,400 in 2019 to $14,000 in 2024, representing a 67% increase that exceeded his farm's profit margins and created impossible choices between paying taxes and maintaining agricultural operations. The isolation that rural farming created had become particularly challenging for Harold since Margaret's death, as their farmhouse was located 3 miles from their nearest neighbors and 15 miles from Henderson's town center, creating social isolation that compounded his financial stress while making daily logistics more expensive and time-consuming. The rural location that had been advantageous for agricultural operations was creating transportation costs and social isolation that made Harold's situation more difficult to manage effectively. Harold's efforts to supplement his agricultural income through part-time employment had been unsuccessful due to his age, his limited experience with non-agricultural work, and the time demands of maintaining farming operations that required daily attention throughout growing seasons. The retail and service positions available in Henderson County typically paid $12 to $15 hourly and required transportation costs and time commitments that would interfere with essential farming activities while generating insufficient income to address his debt obligations. The farm equipment that Harold owned represented substantial assets that were difficult to liquidate due to specialized agricultural applications and limited local markets for used farming machinery. His attempts to sell equipment to reduce debt had generated offers that were far below the outstanding loan balances, creating situations where equipment sales would still leave him with substantial debt while eliminating his ability to maintain agricultural operations. The emotional toll of facing foreclosure was affecting Harold's physical and mental health in ways that made farming operations more difficult to manage effectively. The constant stress of unpaid bills and the prospect of losing his family's four-generation legacy had created anxiety and depression that affected his sleep, appetite, and decision-making capabilities, while also creating social isolation that reduced his access to community support and practical assistance from neighbors and local agricultural organizations. The prospect of foreclosure represented more than just financial loss for Harold. It meant the destruction of his family's 130-year agricultural heritage and his failure to preserve the Morrison family legacy that had sustained 4 generations. Through economic depressions, world wars, and agricultural challenges that previous generations had overcome through hard work, community cooperation, and agricultural innovation. But the most heartbreaking aspect of Harold's situation was his knowledge that his late father, Robert Morrison, had built substantial improvements to their property during the 1980s and 1990s, including renovation of the large tobacco barn that had been constructed in 1944 and had served as the centerpiece of their agricultural operations. The barn, with its massive timber framework and specialized tobacco curing facilities, represented both agricultural heritage and potential economic assets that Harold had never fully explored or utilized for contemporary agricultural or commercial applications. Robert Morrison had been known throughout Henderson County not only for his agricultural expertise, but also for his unusual interest in local history and his extensive knowledge of Kentucky's role in World War II agricultural production and the federal programs that had supported wartime farming operations. Robert had maintained detailed records of agricultural activities and federal assistance programs that had operated throughout Henderson County during the 1940s. Materials that Harold had never examined, but that represented potential historical value and family heritage documentation. The tobacco barn that Robert had renovated during the 1980s had been designed not only for agricultural purposes, but also as a comprehensive storage and workshop facility that included areas for equipment maintenance, grain storage, and organizational systems that exceeded typical agricultural requirements. Robert's construction techniques and storage systems had been sophisticated and well-engineered, reflecting both agricultural expertise and unusual attention to security and preservation features that Harold had always attributed to Robert's careful and thorough approach to farming operations. Harold's childhood memories of the tobacco barn included summers spent helping with tobacco processing and equipment maintenance, but also awareness that certain areas of the barn had remained unused and largely inaccessible throughout decades of family farming operations. Robert had maintained the barn with unusual care and attention to security, keeping certain storage areas locked and explaining that some sections contained family papers and historical materials that required protection from moisture and unauthorized access. The barn's construction features had always seemed sophisticated for typical agricultural applications, with Robert having installed specialized ventilation systems, environmental controls, and security features that exceeded what tobacco curing and equipment storage typically required. Harold had always assumed that Robert's thorough approach reflected his engineering background and his commitment to protecting agricultural equipment and supplies, but had never investigated the specific purposes or contents of storage areas that had remained locked throughout Robert's lifetime. Robert Morrison's death in 2019 had occurred during Harold's crisis management of Margaret's medical situation, when the emotional and financial demands of cancer treatment had prevented Harold from systematically examining family papers, barn, storage areas, or the detailed documentation that Robert had maintained throughout his decades of farming operations. Harold had inherited not only agricultural property and equipment, but also access to storage areas and family materials that he had never explored or organized following Robert's death. As Harold sat in his kitchen on this August morning, calculating whether selling his remaining livestock might delay foreclosure for a few additional weeks, he was unaware that the tobacco barn he was considering renovating as a last resort income strategy contained materials that would attract the attention of federal agencies, national security officials, and historical researchers whose interest in Robert Morrison's legacy would exceed anything Harold had ever imagined possible about his father's seemingly conventional farming operations and community activities. The decision that Harold was being forced to make between immediate foreclosure and desperate renovation attempts represented more than just financial planning. It was a choice between accepting the loss of his family's four-generation agricultural heritage or taking extraordinary risks to preserve Morrison family legacy through building improvements that might generate rental income or commercial applications that could provide sufficient revenue to address his debt obligations and preserve the family farm. But Harold had no idea that within days a federal employee's emergency would bring an expert to his property who would recognize that Robert Morrison's tobacco barn contained architectural features and storage systems that would reveal he had been far more than just a successful Kentucky farmer. He had been the guardian of federal secrets that had remained hidden for over 7 decades, secrets that would save Harold's farm while contributing to America's understanding of one of the most significant wartime intelligence operations in the nation's history. The devastating sequence of events that had reduced Harold Morrison from a successful third-generation farmer to a desperate man facing foreclosure had begun not with any single catastrophe, but with the slow-motion collapse of American agricultural economics that had been systematically destroying family farms throughout Kentucky and across the rural United States for over 2 decades. What made Harold's situation particularly tragic was that everything that had destroyed his family's 4-generation legacy had been beyond his control, representing the intersection of global market forces, corporate agricultural consolidation, and federal policy changes that had eliminated the economic foundations that had sustained family farming throughout the 20th century. The first domino in Harold's cascade of financial destruction had fallen in 2004, when the federal tobacco buyout program had eliminated the price supports and production quotas that had provided stability for Kentucky tobacco farmers since the 1930s. The Master Settlement Agreement of 1998 had already begun reducing tobacco demand and prices, but the 2004 Fair and Equitable Tobacco Reform Act had completely restructured tobacco economics in ways that favored large corporate farming operations, while making small family farms, like the Morrison operation, economically unsustainable, despite decades of successful tobacco production and agricultural expertise. Harold's father, Robert Morrison, had recognized the implications of tobacco program elimination and had attempted to prepare the family farm for economic transition by diversifying into corn and soybean production while maintaining tobacco cultivation at reduced levels that could generate income without requiring substantial additional equipment investments. Robert's transition strategy had been sound and had initially succeeded in maintaining farm profitability during the mid-2000s when commodity prices were favorable and weather conditions supported productive growing seasons that generated sufficient revenue to cover equipment payments and property expenses. But Robert Morrison's sudden death from a heart attack in March 2019 had occurred at the worst possible time for agricultural economics and family farm succession, when declining commodity prices and rising input costs were making farming operations increasingly difficult to manage profitably. Robert's death had forced Harold to assume complete responsibility for agricultural operations during a period when his farming experience was substantial, but his business management skills were limited, and when the economic challenges facing agriculture required expertise in financial planning and market analysis that Harold had never needed to develop during earlier periods of agricultural stability. The timing of Robert's death had been particularly devastating because it had occurred during the critical planning period for the 2019 growing season, when decisions about crop selection, equipment maintenance, and input purchases were essential for successful agricultural operations. Harold had been forced to make complex farming and financial decisions without Robert's guidance and expertise, while also managing grief and the emotional challenges of losing his father and farming mentor during the most stressful period of agricultural planning and preparation that required careful attention to weather forecasts, market projections, and equipment readiness. Harold's assumption of complete farming responsibility had been complicated by his limited experience with the financial and business management aspects of agricultural operations that Robert had handled throughout Harold's adult life. While Harold possessed extensive practical knowledge of farming techniques, equipment operation, and agricultural production, he had never been responsible for financial planning, tax compliance, equipment financing, or the complex business decisions that contemporary farming required for economic survival in increasingly competitive agricultural markets. The 2019 growing season that Harold had managed immediately following Robert's death had been challenging due to excessive rainfall during planting periods and drought conditions during critical growing phases that had reduced crop yields while increasing production costs and equipment wear. The weather-related crop losses had eliminated most of Harold's anticipated revenue for 2019, while equipment repairs and additional fuel consumption had increased operating expenses, creating a situation where Harold's first year of independent farm management had resulted in significant financial losses rather than the modest profits that he had expected based on Robert's previous success. The crop insurance that Robert had maintained had provided minimal compensation for weather-related losses due to deductibles and coverage limitations that reflected the insurance industry's reluctance to provide comprehensive protection for agricultural operations in regions that experience frequent weather challenges. The insurance settlement that Harold had received for 2019 crop losses had totaled $8,400, an amount that was insufficient to offset the $23,000 in additional expenses and lost revenue that had resulted from weather conditions and Harold's inexperience with crisis management during adverse agricultural conditions. Harold's financial difficulties had been compounded by inheritance tax obligations that had been triggered by Robert's death and the transfer of farm ownership to Harold. While the farm property had qualified for agricultural use valuation that reduced taxable value, the inheritance taxes had still totaled $12,000 due to equipment values and life insurance proceeds that had exceeded exemption thresholds. The inheritance tax payment had been due within 9 months of Robert's death, requiring Harold to deplete savings that had been intended for equipment maintenance and operating expenses during a period when agricultural income was insufficient to cover basic farming costs. The legal and administrative expenses associated with settling Robert's estate had consumed additional resources that Harold needed for agricultural operations, with attorney fees, court costs, and administrative procedures totaling over $8,000, while requiring substantial time and attention during critical farming periods. The estate settlement process had been complicated by equipment liens and business arrangements that required legal documentation and financial analysis, creating delays and expenses that prevented Harold from focusing completely on agricultural operations during the challenging 2019 growing season. Harold's inexperience with agricultural financial management had created additional problems during 2020 and 2021, when his unfamiliarity with commodity marketing and crop pricing had resulted in poor timing decisions that had reduced his revenue below what experienced farmers were achieving with similar crop production. Harold's tendency to sell crops immediately after harvest, rather than using storage and marketing strategies that could take advantage of seasonal price variations, had cost him approximately $15,000 in lost revenue during 2020 and another $18,000 during 2021, amounts that would have been sufficient to maintain his equipment payments and prevent debt accumulation. The equipment maintenance problems that had developed during Harold's independent farming operations reflected both the aging of machinery that Robert had purchased during the 1990s and early 2000s, and Harold's limited experience with preventive maintenance and repair procedures that were essential for extending equipment life and avoiding costly breakdown repairs. The John Deere tractor that had been reliable during Robert's management had begun experiencing hydraulic system failures and transmission problems that required expensive repairs totaling over $12,000 during 2020 and 2021, costs that exceeded Harold's maintenance budget and forced him to use credit cards and equipment loans to maintain operational capability. The tobacco harvester that Robert had purchased in 2003 had required increasingly expensive annual maintenance and repairs that reflected both normal wear and Harold's inexperience with the careful operating procedures that were necessary for protecting specialized agricultural equipment from damage and excessive wear. The harvester's maintenance costs had increased from approximately $3,000 annually during Robert's operation to over $8,000 during Harold's first 3 years of independent farming, creating equipment expenses that exceeded the revenue generated by tobacco production and making tobacco cultivation economically unsustainable, despite Harold's substantial investment in tobacco-specific equipment. The corn planter that Harold had inherited from Robert had suffered mechanical damage during the 2020 planting season, when Harold's inexperience with field conditions and equipment settings had resulted in excessive wear and component failures that required replacement of major mechanical systems. The planter repairs had cost $14,000 and had delayed planting operations by 2 weeks, reducing crop yields and creating additional stress on other equipment that had been used for emergency planting procedures that were less efficient and more demanding than normal agricultural operations. Harold's efforts to reduce equipment costs by performing his own maintenance and repairs had been largely unsuccessful due to his limited mechanical expertise and the complexity of contemporary agricultural equipment that required specialized tools and technical knowledge that Harold had never acquired during his years of working with Robert. Harold's attempts at self-repair had sometimes created additional damage and expenses that exceeded the costs of professional repair services, while consuming substantial time that was needed for farming operations and preventing Harold from pursuing off-farm income opportunities that might have improved his financial situation. The declining agricultural commodity prices that had affected all crop production during Harold's independent farming operations had been particularly devastating for small-scale operations that lacked the economies of scale necessary for maintaining profitability during periods of low commodity prices. Corn prices had declined from $4.20 per bushel during Robert's final years to $3.40 per bushel during Harold's farming operations, reducing revenue by approximately $12,000 annually, while production costs had remained constant or increased due to rising fuel and fertilizer prices that affected all agricultural operations. Soybean prices had experienced similar declines, from $9.80 per bushel during favorable market conditions to $8.20 per bushel during Harold's farming operations, reducing revenue from Harold's 60 acres of soybeans by approximately $8,000 annually, while requiring the same equipment, labor, and input costs that had been profitable during Robert's successful farming operations. The commodity price declines had been particularly frustrating for Harold because his crop yields had been comparable to or better than Robert's historical production, but market conditions had eliminated the profitability that had sustained the Morrison farm for decades. The tobacco price deterioration that had accelerated during Harold's independent farming operations had been the most devastating aspect of his agricultural income decline, with tobacco prices falling from $1.85 per pound during Robert's final years to $1.12 per pound during Harold's operations, reducing revenue from tobacco production by over $25,000 annually, while requiring the same intensive labor and specialized equipment that had been profitable when tobacco prices were higher. The tobacco price decline had been particularly damaging because tobacco had historically been the Morrison farm's most profitable crop and had provided the margin that made overall agricultural operations economically sustainable. The federal and state agricultural support programs that had provided assistance to farmers during previous periods of economic difficulty had been systematically reduced or eliminated during the period when Harold needed assistance most, reflecting political and fiscal priorities that favored corporate agriculture and urban interests over small family farming operations. The Conservation Reserve Program payments that had supplemented farm income during Robert's operations had been reduced by 40% due to funding limitations and program restrictions that prevented Harold from accessing assistance that had been available to previous generations of farmers. The Farm Service Agency emergency loan programs that had previously provided assistance to farmers experiencing weather-related losses or equipment failures had become increasingly restrictive and bureaucratic, with application procedures that required extensive financial documentation and debt-to-income ratios that automatically disqualified farmers who were experiencing the kinds of financial difficulties that the programs were supposedly designed to address. Harold's applications for emergency agricultural assistance had been denied due to debt obligations that exceeded program guidelines, creating a situation where assistance was unavailable to farmers who needed help most. The agricultural extension. Services that had provided technical assistance and educational support to farmers during previous generations had been substantially reduced due to state budget limitations and changing priorities that emphasized urban and suburban programs over rural agricultural support. The extension agent who had provided advice and assistance to Robert Morrison throughout his farming career had been eliminated in 2018, leaving Harold without access to the technical expertise and agricultural guidance that had been essential for successful farming operations during previous decades. Harold's limited education and inexperience with contemporary business practices had created additional challenges for managing agricultural operations that required increasingly sophisticated financial planning and market analysis for economic survival. Harold's high school education and practical farming experience had been sufficient for agricultural work during earlier periods when farming was less complex and business management requirements were minimal. But contemporary agriculture required expertise in financial analysis, marketing strategies, and regulatory compliance that Harold had never needed to develop. The computer and internet skills that contemporary farming required for accessing market information, completing regulatory paperwork, and managing financial records had been areas where Harold's limited technical experience created substantial disadvantages compared to younger farmers who had grown up with digital technology. Harold's attempts to use online resources for agricultural planning and market analysis had been largely unsuccessful due to his unfamiliarity with digital systems and his reluctance to invest time in learning computer skills when farming operations required immediate attention and physical labor. The social isolation that had affected Harold since Robert's death had been compounded by Margaret's cancer diagnosis in 2020, which had occurred during a period when Harold was already struggling with agricultural management and financial difficulties that required careful attention and decision-making capabilities. Margaret's illness had created emotional stress and medical expenses that had further compromised Harold's ability to manage farming operations effectively, while also eliminating her assistance with farm records, financial planning, and the emotional support that had been essential for Harold's success during previous periods of agricultural challenges. Margaret Morrison had been far more than Harold's wife. She had been his essential partner in managing the complex demands of contemporary farming operations that required careful attention to financial planning, regulatory compliance, and record-keeping that Harold had never been comfortable managing independently. Margaret's experience as an elementary school teacher had provided her with organizational skills and attention to detail that had been invaluable for managing farm finances, tax preparation, and the documentation required for agricultural programs and equipment financing that were essential for successful farming operations. Margaret's role in managing farm financial records had been particularly important because contemporary agriculture required extensive documentation for tax purposes, regulatory compliance, and equipment financing that demanded careful attention to detail and systematic record-keeping that Harold found overwhelming and time-consuming. Margaret had maintained detailed records of agricultural expenses, crop yields, equipment maintenance, and financial transactions that were essential for tax preparation and business planning, responsibilities that Harold had struggled to manage. Effectively, after Margaret became too ill to continue her administrative assistance, The medical expenses associated with Margaret's cancer treatment had begun accumulating in 2020 and had continued until her death in December 2022, creating financial obligations that had consumed the savings and credit resources that Harold needed for agricultural operations, while also requiring substantial time and emotional energy that was essential for farming success. The chemotherapy treatments that Margaret had received at the James Graham Brown Cancer Center in Louisville had required weekly trips that consumed entire days and had created transportation costs that exceeded $400 monthly while preventing Harold from attending to essential farming activities during critical agricultural periods. Margaret's cancer treatment had required medications and procedures that were not fully covered by their health insurance policy, creating out-of-pocket expenses that had exceeded $67,000, despite their attempts to minimize costs through generic medications and reduce treatment frequencies that had compromised Margaret's care while still creating financial obligations that Harold couldn't afford. The medical debt that had accumulated during Margaret's illness had been particularly devastating because it had occurred during the same period when Harold's agricultural income was declining due to commodity price reductions and equipment problems that were already creating financial stress. The life insurance policy that Harold and Margaret had maintained had been reduced from $50,000 to $15,000 due to premium payment difficulties during Margaret's illness, eliminating the financial protection that had been intended to provide Harold with resources for adjusting to widowhood and managing agricultural operations without Margaret's assistance. The insurance reduction had been necessary to maintain coverage during Margaret's illness, but had eliminated most of the financial protection that could have provided Harold with time to develop alternative income sources or adjust farming operations to his reduced management capabilities. Margaret's death in December 2022 had eliminated not only Harold's emotional support and practical assistance, but also her $23,000 annual teaching income that had been essential for covering household expenses and agricultural equipment payments that Harold's farming income couldn't support independently. Margaret's teaching salary had provided the financial margin that had made their agricultural operations economically sustainable despite declining commodity prices and rising equipment costs, and her death had created a $23,000 annual income reduction that made Harold's financial situation completely unsustainable. The emotional impact of Margaret's death had affected Harold's physical and mental health in ways that had compromised his ability to manage agricultural operations effectively during the critical period when he needed to develop alternative income sources or adjust farming operations to address his changed financial circumstances. The grief and depression that had followed Margaret's death had created sleep disruption, appetite problems, and decision-making difficulties that had interfered with the careful planning and daily attention that successful farming operations required, while also reducing Harold's motivation and energy for pursuing solutions to his financial difficulties. The social isolation that had resulted from Margaret's death had been compounded by the rural location of the Morrison farm and Harold's limited social connections outside of his marriage and farming operations. The nearest neighbors were 3 miles away, and Harold's daily contact with other people had been minimal since Margaret's death, creating emotional isolation that had made his financial stress more difficult to manage while also reducing his access to practical advice and emotional support that could have helped him develop strategies for addressing his agricultural and financial challenges. Harold's attempts to maintain agricultural operations at previous levels, despite his reduced management capabilities and financial resources, had created a pattern of increasing debt and declining operational efficiency that had accelerated his financial deterioration during 2023 and early 2024. Harold's determination to preserve his family's farming legacy had prevented him from making the difficult decisions about reducing agricultural operations or seeking alternative income sources that might have stabilized his financial situation before foreclosure became inevitable. The equipment failures and maintenance problems that had accelerated during 2023 had been particularly devastating because they had occurred during critical farming periods when equipment downtime could destroy entire crops and eliminate seasonal income that Harold depended upon for debt service and basic living expenses. The hydraulic system failure on Harold's John Deere tractor during the 2023 planting season had required emergency repairs that had cost $8,400 and had delayed planting operations by 10 days, reducing crop yields and creating additional stress on other equipment that had been used for emergency farming procedures. The property tax increases that Henderson County had implemented during 2023 and 2024 had been the final element in Harold's financial collapse, creating fixed expenses that exceeded his declining agricultural income while providing no corresponding increase in agricultural productivity or support services that could justify the additional tax burden. The property tax increase from $8,400 to $14,000 had represented a $5,600 annual increase in fixed expenses that Harold's declining agricultural income couldn't support, creating the final gap between income and expenses that had made foreclosure inevitable, despite Harold's efforts to maintain agricultural operations and preserve his family's farming legacy. With foreclosure proceedings scheduled to begin in exactly 21 days, and every conventional option for generating income exhausted, Harold Morrison found himself staring at the massive tobacco barn that his father Robert had renovated during the 1980s, a structure that represented his final desperate hope for creating rental income that might delay the inevitable loss of his family's four-generation agricultural heritage. The barn, built originally in 1944 and extensively renovated by Robert between 1985 and 1989, stood as the most substantial and well-constructed building on the Morrison property, its massive timber framework and sophisticated ventilation systems, reflecting engineering capabilities and construction expertise that had always seemed unusually advanced for typical agricultural applications in rural Henderson County. Harold's consideration of the barn renovation project as a potential income source had been motivated by sheer desperation rather than realistic business planning. But his growing examination of the building's construction features and potential commercial applications was revealing aspects of his father's work that Harold had never fully appreciated or understood during Robert's lifetime. The barn's structural design, environmental control systems, and organizational features exceeded what tobacco curing and equipment storage typically required, suggesting that Robert had built the facility with capabilities and purposes that had remained hidden from his family throughout decades of apparently conventional farming operations. The economic analysis that Harold had attempted for barn renovation and rental operations was both promising and terrifying, indicating that substantial renovation investments of $25,000 to $35,000 might generate monthly rental income of $2,500 to $4,000 if the facility could attract tenants who needed large storage spaces, workshop facilities, or event venues that were scarce in rural Henderson County. The potential rental income could address Harold's immediate debt obligations and possibly prevent foreclosure if renovation costs could be financed and suitable tenants could be identified. But the financial risks of borrowing additional money, when he was already facing bankruptcy, made the barn renovation project seem almost as dangerous as accepting foreclosure. Harold's preliminary assessment of renovation requirements had indicated that the barn's structural systems were remarkably sound despite being over 80 years old, with foundation work, timber framing, and roofing that appeared to require minimal repairs or improvements for commercial applications. The electrical system that Robert had installed during his 1980s renovation included 220-volt service and circuit capacity that exceeded typical agricultural requirements, while the plumbing system included multiple water sources and drainage, features that suggested Robert had anticipated uses beyond tobacco curing and equipment storage when he had designed the renovation project. The heating and ventilation systems that Robert had incorporated into the barn renovation were particularly sophisticated, with environmental controls and air circulation capabilities that seemed designed for applications requiring precise temperature and humidity management rather than the relatively simple requirements of tobacco curing operations. Harold had always assumed that Robert's thorough approach to environmental control reflected his engineering background and his commitment to protecting agricultural equipment and supplies. But his detailed examination of the systems was revealing. Features that exceeded what typical agricultural applications would require or justify economically. But as Harold spent increasing amounts of time examining the barn construction and planning potential renovation strategies, he was beginning to recognize aspects of his father's background and activities that had remained mysterious or unexplained throughout Robert's lifetime. Robert Morrison had been known throughout Henderson County not only for his agricultural expertise and farming success, but also for his unusual interests in local history, federal agricultural programs, and what had appeared to be extensive correspondence with government agencies and historical organizations that had seemed unrelated to typical farming operations. The true story of Robert Morrison's background and the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him to Henderson County, Kentucky, had been far more complex and significant than anything his family had ever understood or that Robert had ever revealed during his decades of successful farming operations. What Harold had never known about his father was that Robert Morrison's presence in rural Kentucky and his decision to purchase and renovate the specific property that had become the Morrison family farm had been motivated not by agricultural opportunities or family heritage, but by his role as a covert guardian of classified federal materials that required secure storage and protection in a location that could maintain the appearance of typical agricultural operations while providing sophisticated security and preservation capabilities. Robert Morrison's true identity had been Robert Michael Kowalski, a World War II intelligence analyst and document preservation specialist who had worked for the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and later for the Central Intelligence Agency, during the critical years of post-war intelligence reorganization and the establishment of America's contemporary national security apparatus. Robert's specialized expertise in document analysis, intelligence preservation, and secure storage systems had made him essential for protecting classified materials and intelligence archives that required long-term preservation in locations that could remain undetected by foreign intelligence services and unauthorized individuals who might attempt to access sensitive information. The decision to relocate Robert from his OSS position in Washington, D.C. to rural Kentucky in 1967 had been part of a comprehensive federal program for establishing secure storage and preservation facilities for classified intelligence materials in locations throughout the United States that could provide long-term protection while maintaining the appearance of typical civilian operations. The program, known internally as Operation Safekeep, had been designed to address concerns about the vulnerability of centralized intelligence archives to foreign espionage, natural disasters, and potential security breaches that could compromise decades of accumulated intelligence assets and operational capabilities. Robert's assignment to Henderson County, Kentucky, had been based on careful analysis of geographical, demographic, and security factors that made rural agricultural areas ideal for concealing intelligence preservation facilities that required sophisticated environmental controls and security systems while maintaining complete operational secrecy over extended periods. The Kentucky location had been selected specifically because its agricultural economy, stable population, and distance from major urban centers created optimal conditions for long-term covert operations that needed to remain undetected for decades, while protecting materials of extraordinary national security significance. The specific property that Robert had purchased in Henderson County had been identified through federal geological and security surveys that had determined it possessed unique characteristics for supporting classified storage operations, including geological stability, underground water systems, and topographical features that could accommodate sophisticated construction projects while remaining invisible to aerial surveillance and casual observation. The property's existing agricultural buildings and operations had provided perfect cover for renovation projects that could incorporate advanced preservation and security technologies while maintaining the appearance of typical farming improvements. The tobacco barn that Robert had extensively renovated during the 1980s had been designed not as an agricultural facility, but as a sophisticated intelligence preservation and storage complex that could protect classified documents, photographic materials, and technical intelligence assets under environmental conditions that would maintain material integrity for decades or potentially centuries. Robert's engineering background and his specialized training in intelligence preservation techniques had been essential for creating storage systems that could protect materials from moisture, temperature fluctuations, chemical deterioration, and unauthorized access, while remaining completely undetectable during routine agricultural operations and community interactions. The renovation project that Robert had undertaken between 1985 and 1989 had incorporated technologies and construction techniques that were far more advanced than anything typically available for agricultural applications during that period. The environmental control systems that Robert had installed included precision climate control, humidity regulation, and air filtration capabilities that could maintain archival storage conditions for paper documents, photographic materials, and electronic media that required protection from environmental conditions that could cause deterioration or data loss over extended storage periods. The security systems that Robert had built into the barn renovation included multiple layers of concealment and protection that were designed to prevent detection and unauthorized access, while allowing Robert to maintain and monitor the stored materials throughout his lifetime. The storage areas that Robert had constructed were accessible through concealed entrances and mechanical systems that were integrated into the barn's agricultural appearance, requiring specific knowledge and procedures for access while remaining invisible to anyone who wasn't familiar with the security arrangements. The classified materials that Robert had been assigned to protect included some of the most sensitive intelligence assets accumulated by American intelligence services during World War II and the early Cold War period, including captured Nazi intelligence documents, Soviet espionage materials, and operational files from intelligence operations that had been conducted throughout Europe and the Pacific during the war years. The historical and contemporary significance of these materials had made their protection a matter of national security priority that required the highest levels of secrecy and security that the intelligence community could provide. The Nazi intelligence. Documents that comprised the largest portion of Robert's assigned materials had been captured during the final months of World War II, when American and Allied forces had overrun German intelligence facilities and government offices throughout occupied Europe. These documents included operational files from the Abwehr, German military intelligence, the Sicherheitsdienst, SS intelligence service, and various Nazi research and development programs that had produced intelligence about Allied operations, resistance movements, and scientific developments that remained classified due to their sensitivity and potential impact on contemporary intelligence operations. The most significant portion of Robert's archived materials consisted of Nazi intelligence files that documented German espionage operations conducted within the United States during the war years, including the identities of German agents, their American contacts, and intelligence networks that had operated throughout the United States during the period when German intelligence services had been attempting to gather information about American military production, scientific research, and strategic planning. These files contained information that could still be sensitive in the 1980s and beyond, due to the involvement of American citizens and organizations that had cooperated with German intelligence operations. The Soviet espionage materials that Robert had been assigned to protect included documents and evidence that had been gathered by American intelligence services during the immediate post-war period, when the United States and Soviet Union had been transitioning from wartime allies to Cold War adversaries. These materials documented Soviet intelligence operations within the United States, including espionage activities, agent networks, and intelligence-gathering operations that had been conducted by Soviet intelligence services during the war years, and the early post-war period when American and Soviet intelligence agencies had been competing for access to German scientific and intelligence assets. The operational files from American intelligence operations that Robert was protecting included documentation from OSS operations conducted throughout Europe and the Pacific during World War II, including agent reports, operational planning documents, and intelligence assessments that had been classified due to their disclosure of intelligence methods, agent identities, and operational capabilities that could compromise contemporary intelligence operations if they became publicly available. These files represented decades of accumulated intelligence assets that had been essential for American victory during World War II and continued to be valuable for understanding intelligence operations and capabilities during the Cold War period. The technical intelligence materials that Robert had been assigned to protect included captured German scientific research documents, weapons development files, and technological assessments that had been gathered by American intelligence services. During the occupation of Germany and the post-war recruitment of German scientists and engineers through programs like Operation Paperclip, these materials included research on rocket technology, chemical weapons, nuclear research, and other scientific developments that had remained classified due to their potential military applications and their relationship to contemporary American defense research programs. Robert's role as guardian of these intelligence materials had required not only sophisticated preservation and security capabilities, but also ongoing communication with federal intelligence agencies and periodic updates of storage procedures and security arrangements that reflected changing technology and security requirements. Robert's apparent isolation in rural Kentucky had actually been supported by regular contact with intelligence officials who monitored the security and condition of the stored materials while maintaining the operational secrecy that was essential for protecting the storage facility from detection or compromise. The communication systems that Robert had maintained with federal agencies had been carefully designed to avoid creating obvious connections between his Kentucky farming operations and government intelligence activities, using mail forwarding, services, telephone arrangements, and periodic personal meetings that appeared to be routine business or social activities, while actually serving as opportunities for intelligence officials to assess storage security and coordinate any necessary updates to preservation or security procedures. The financial support that Robert had received for his intelligence preservation activities had been channeled through agricultural programs and business arrangements that provided legitimate explanations for his farming success and property improvements, while actually funding the sophisticated technological systems and security measures that were required for protecting classified intelligence materials. Robert's apparent success as a Kentucky farmer had been enhanced by federal subsidies and support that were disguised as routine agricultural assistance, while actually funding one of the most significant intelligence preservation operations in American history. The agricultural expertise that Robert had developed during his decades in Henderson County had been genuine and substantial, reflecting his commitment to maintaining authentic farming operations that could provide effective cover for his intelligence activities, while also contributing to his family's financial security and community integration. Robert's success as a farmer had been essential for his acceptance in rural Kentucky communities and had provided the social connections and local reputation that were necessary for avoiding suspicion about his background or activities. The decision to maintain complete secrecy about his intelligence background, even from his own family, had been based on security requirements that demanded operational compartmentalization and personal security measures that could protect both the classified materials and Robert's family from potential threats that could result from foreign intelligence interest in the storage facility or the materials it contained. Robert's success in maintaining his cover identity for over 5 decades had represented one of the most successful long-term covert operations in American intelligence history. But Robert's sudden death in 2019 had created a critical security situation for the federal agencies that depended on his guardianship of classified materials, as his death had eliminated the operational security and preservation expertise that had protected extremely sensitive intelligence assets for over 50 years. The federal response to Robert's death had been complicated by the need to maintain operational secrecy while also ensuring continued protection of materials that remained classified and potentially sensitive due to their historical significance and contemporary intelligence value. The decision to allow Robert's property and the classified storage facility to pass to Harold through normal inheritance procedures had been based on assessments that indicated immediate federal intervention could compromise operational secrecy and create security problems that exceeded the risks of temporary interruption in professional supervision of the storage facility. Federal intelligence officials had concluded that Harold's apparent focus on agricultural operations and his limited interest in his father's non-farming activities created acceptable conditions for temporary continuation of storage operations. Until appropriate long-term arrangements could be developed, Harold's complete ignorance of his father's intelligence background and the true nature of the materials stored in the renovated tobacco barn had been considered advantageous by federal security officials who preferred that the storage facility continue operating under civilian cover rather than transitioning to obvious federal supervision that could attract attention from foreign intelligence services or domestic security threats. Harold's natural assumption that his father had been a conventional farmer provided optimal cover for continued protection of classified materials that remained sensitive despite their age and historical context. The sophisticated preservation and security systems that Robert had built into the tobacco barn had been designed to continue operating effectively for extended periods without professional supervision, using technologies and procedures that could maintain optimal storage. conditions and security protection while awaiting eventual federal assessment and possible transition to alternative arrangements. Robert's planning had anticipated the possibility of his death or incapacitation and had incorporated systems that could protect the classified materials even during periods when professional intelligence supervision was temporarily unavailable. But the federal agencies responsible for the classified materials had been monitoring Harold's financial situation and the potential threats to the storage facility that could result from foreclosure proceedings or property sales that might bring unauthorized individuals into contact with the concealed storage areas and classified materials. The approaching foreclosure of Harold's farm had created an urgent security situation that required immediate federal intervention to protect classified materials while maintaining operational secrecy and avoiding public disclosure of the intelligence preservation facility that had operated successfully for over 50 years. The contingency plans that had been developed for addressing security emergencies at Robert's facility included procedures for rapid federal intervention and material recovery operations that could be implemented if circumstances threatened the continued security of the storage facility or the classified materials it contained. These plans had been designed to provide federal agencies with options for protecting intelligence assets while minimizing public attention and maintaining secrecy about the true nature of Robert's activities and the materials he had been protecting. As Harold continued his desperate examination of barn renovation possibilities during the final weeks before foreclosure, he remained completely unaware that his financial crisis was creating national security concerns for federal agencies who had been monitoring his situation and preparing contingency responses that could protect classified intelligence materials while potentially providing solutions to Harold's financial problems that might preserve both his farm and the continued security of one of America's most significant intelligence preservation facilities. The resolution of Harold's crisis would require careful coordination between his legitimate needs for financial assistance and federal requirements for continued protection of classified materials that had been safely stored in his tobacco barn for over 3 decades. The extraordinary value of the intelligence materials that Robert had protected, combined with the federal government's responsibility for their continued security, had created circumstances that could transform Harold's desperate situation into opportunities for cooperation that might benefit both his family's economic survival and America's ongoing intelligence preservation requirements. But Harold had no idea that his father's tobacco barn contained classified intelligence materials worth tens of millions of dollars to the federal government, or that his approaching foreclosure was being monitored by federal agencies whose interest in preserving the Morrison family farm would soon exceed anything Harold could have imagined possible about his father's seemingly ordinary agricultural operations and community activities throughout Henderson County, Kentucky. It was 3:47 p.m. on that catastrophic August afternoon when the sound of a struggling engine and desperate honking first penetrated the ominous silence that had settled over the Morrison farm as Kentucky's most devastating tornado in recorded history began carving a path of destruction through Henderson County, forcing all residents to seek immediate shelter while creating emergency conditions that would bring federal expertise directly to Harold's property in circumstances that would seem miraculous to anyone who didn't understand the sophisticated planning and monitoring that had been protecting Robert Morrison's intelligence preservation facility for over 5 decades. The F4 tornado that was approaching Henderson County with wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour had already destroyed dozens of homes and farms throughout western Kentucky, creating emergency conditions that were forcing all non-essential personnel to evacuate the region while emergency responders struggled to provide assistance during weather conditions that made travel extremely dangerous for anyone without specialized equipment and emergency training. Harold Morrison had been monitoring weather reports throughout the day while continuing his desperate examination of barn renovation possibilities. Understanding that severe weather posed additional threats to his property and equipment that he couldn't afford to repair or replace. The vehicle that was approaching Harold's farm, with obvious mechanical distress, belonged to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a 43-year-old federal archivist and intelligence document specialist who worked for the National Archives and Records Administration's Special Access Programs Division, which was responsible for managing and preserving classified materials that required the highest levels of security and professional expertise. Dr. Walsh had been traveling from a classified briefing at Fort Knox to her home in Nashville when the tornado had created mechanical problems with her government vehicle while also making the interstate highways too dangerous for continued travel at normal speeds. Dr. Walsh's professional background included advanced degrees in archival science and intelligence history from Georgetown University, specialized training in classified document preservation from the CIA's Archives and Records Center, and over 15 years of experience managing some of America's most sensitive intelligence materials from World War II through the contemporary period. Her expertise in wartime intelligence operations and document preservation techniques had made her one of the leading federal authorities on OSS archives, Nazi intelligence materials, and the specialized storage systems that had been used throughout American history for protecting classified assets that remained sensitive decades after their creation. The classified briefing that Dr. Walsh had attended at Fort Knox had focused on recently discovered security concerns related to several rural intelligence preservation facilities that had been established during the Cold War period, including Operation Safekeep installations that required immediate assessment and possible transition to contemporary federal management due to changing security requirements and the death or incapacitation of civilian guardians who had been protecting classified materials under covert arrangements that were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain securely. Dr. Walsh's assignment to assess intelligence preservation facilities throughout the southeastern United States had been motivated by federal concerns about the security and condition of classified materials that had been stored in rural locations. For decades, under arrangements that had been appropriate during the Cold War, but were now creating potential security vulnerabilities due to changing demographics, technological developments, and the aging or death of civilian personnel who had been essential for maintaining operational security and material preservation quality. The specific intelligence preservation facility that Dr. Walsh had been assigned to assess in Henderson County, Kentucky, was the storage operation that Robert Morrison had maintained at his tobacco farm, where classified materials worth an estimated $47 million had been protected under covert arrangements that had been established in 1967 and had continued operating successfully until Robert's death in 2019 had created urgent federal concerns about continued security and preservation of materials that remained classified and potentially sensitive due to their historical significance and contemporary intelligence value. As Dr. Walsh's disabled government vehicle reached the Morrison property entrance, Harold could see that she was clearly experiencing an emergency situation that had forced her to seek help at the first property she could reach along the increasingly treacherous county road that connected rural farms throughout Henderson County. Her vehicle's cooling system was overheating despite the approaching storm conditions, creating clouds of steam that were making visibility difficult, while warning lights on her dashboard were indicating multiple system failures that had brought her emergency to a complete halt just as weather conditions were becoming life-threatening for anyone caught in the open. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry to bother you during this dangerous weather," Dr. Walsh called out as she carefully climbed from her steaming vehicle, her professional demeanor remaining calm despite obvious stress about both her mechanical problems and the approaching tornado. "My car has broken down, and I'm very concerned about staying safe during this storm. Would it be possible to use your phone to call for assistance, and perhaps wait inside until this tornado passes or conditions improve enough for safe travel?" Harold looked at this woman, recognizing the kind of genuine distress and professional competence that reflected someone who was accustomed to managing complex situations but was currently facing circumstances beyond her control. Despite his family's own desperate financial situation and his anxiety about protecting his property during the approaching tornado, Harold's instinctive response to people in emergency situations reflected the rural Kentucky values and community cooperation that had sustained farming families through natural disasters and crisis situations for generations. "Of course," Harold replied immediately, helping Dr. Walsh gather her briefcase and emergency supplies from her disabled vehicle. "Let's get you inside where it's safe, and we'll figure out what we can do about your car and this storm. I'm Harold Morrison, and this is our family farm. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, until it's safe to travel again." Dr. Walsh introduced herself as they hurried toward the farmhouse, explaining that she was a federal employee returning from a business meeting and expressing gratitude for assistance that could literally be life-saving, given the combination of mechanical failure and dangerous weather conditions. Her professional training had taught her to remain calm during crisis situations, but she was obviously relieved to find help from people who understood the seriousness of tornado emergencies in rural Kentucky. As the tornado approached and they took shelter in Harold's farmhouse basement, Dr. Walsh found herself in extended conversation with Harold about his property, his family history, and the challenges facing farmers who were attempting to maintain agricultural operations while managing the complex demands of rural property ownership during periods of economic difficulty. Her federal background and professional training had given her extensive knowledge about rural American communities and the agricultural economics that had shaped farming families throughout Kentucky and other agricultural regions during the post-World War II period. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Walsh said as they waited for the tornado to pass and examined the historical photographs and family documents that Harold had brought to the basement for protection, "your family's story seems to reflect many of the agricultural and community experiences that I study in my professional research. Your father's generation of farmers had to navigate some very significant changes in agricultural economics and federal programs during the post-war period that affected farming communities throughout the United States." Dr. Walsh's professional expertise in federal programs and historical research had trained her to recognize family stories and agricultural operations that might reflect more complex backgrounds than typical farming activities, especially during the period when federal agencies had been establishing various covert and semi-covert programs throughout rural America that had required civilian cooperation and participation. Harold's descriptions of his father's farming success, construction expertise, and apparent interest in federal programs were creating professional curiosity that went beyond polite conversation during emergency shelter. As the tornado passed, and they emerged from the basement to assess damage to Harold's property, Dr. Walsh began sharing her professional knowledge about federal agricultural programs and the various ways that rural communities had been affected by government activities during the Cold War period, when federal agencies had been implementing programs throughout rural America that had provided both economic benefits and national security capabilities. Her knowledge of federal programs and rural development initiatives provided historical context that helped Harold understand his family's farming success within broader patterns of federal support for agricultural communities. Dr. Walsh, Harold, said his curiosity growing about the federal programs that might have affected his family's farming operations. "You seem to know a great deal about government programs and rural communities during the period when my father was establishing his farming operations." Robert Morrison was obviously a successful farmer and skilled craftsman, but he always seemed to have access to resources and expertise that exceeded what most farmers in Henderson County were able to obtain during that period. Dr. Walsh's professional training and research experience had taught her to recognize indicators of federal involvement in rural operations that might warrant further investigation. And her conversation with Harold was revealing family history details and property characteristics that suggested Robert Morrison's activities might have been more complex and significant than typical agricultural operations. The timing of his farming success, his apparent construction expertise, and the sophisticated features of his property were creating professional interest that exceeded casual historical curiosity. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Walsh said, "there are definitely research methods and federal records that could provide more information about your father's activities and the programs that might have supported his farming operations. The federal agricultural and rural development programs from that era are quite well documented, and someone with Robert Morrison's apparent success and expertise would likely have left records that could be discovered through systematic research of federal archives and program documentation." As weather conditions improved and Dr. Walsh waited for emergency roadside assistance to arrive, she found herself spending additional time examining Harold's property and learning more about Robert Morrison's construction techniques and the unusual design features that had attracted her professional attention. Her federal training in facility assessment and her extensive knowledge of covert government operations had taught her to recognize architectural and construction details that might reflect purposes or security requirements beyond typical agricultural applications. The tobacco barn areas of the Morrison property were particularly interesting to Dr. Walsh's professional expertise, especially the massive timber framing, the sophisticated foundation work, and the structural elements that seemed designed for supporting operations that exceeded typical tobacco processing requirements. Her questions about the barn construction and Robert Morrison's design choices were revealing details that Harold had never considered significant, but that reflected construction features that were consistent with federal facility requirements during the Cold War period. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Walsh said, as Harold showed her through the barn areas where they had moved equipment and supplies to protect them from tornado damage. "Some of these construction features are quite unusual for agricultural operations from that time period. The foundation work, structural reinforcement, and environmental control systems suggest that your father designed these spaces for operations that might have required much more sophisticated capabilities than typical farming applications would need." Harold's tour of the barn areas had been motivated by his desire to be helpful during Dr. Walsh's emergency situation and his interest in her professional knowledge about federal programs and construction techniques. But her observations about unusual structural features were making Harold more aware of design elements that he had always attributed to Robert Morrison's thorough and skilled approach to agricultural construction. Dr. Walsh's questions were encouraging Harold to examine his property with new perspectives and to consider whether Robert Morrison's construction choices might have reflected purposes that subsequent generations had never understood. The conversation about Robert Morrison's construction techniques and design choices had naturally led to discussions about other aspects of the property that might reflect unusual features or federal involvement. Dr. Walsh's professional training in federal facility assessment and her expertise in covert operations had created interest in any architectural details, construction features, or family papers that might provide insights into Robert Morrison's background and activities during his decades of operating what had appeared to be a conventional farming operation. "Dr. Walsh," Harold said, "Robert Morrison was obviously a man who planned carefully and built things to last, but he never talked much about his background before coming to Kentucky or his knowledge of construction and engineering techniques that seem quite advanced for typical farming applications. After he died in 2019, I inherited not only the farm, but also areas of the barn that he had always kept locked and said contained family papers and business records that required protection from moisture and unauthorized access." Dr. Walsh's federal training had taught her that valuable intelligence materials were often preserved in unexpected locations, and that careful examination of buildings, storage areas, and rural properties could reveal documents, artifacts, or construction features that provided insights into federal operations and classified activities that had not been recorded in obvious places. Her professional expertise encouraged systematic investigation of historical sites that might contain undiscovered materials of federal significance. Historical documents and classified materials from that era were often stored in locations that provided protection from environmental hazards and unauthorized access, Dr. Walsh explained, her professional training now fully engaged with what could be a significant federal discovery. Federal personnel involved in classified programs during the Cold War were particularly careful about preserving documentation that proved their assignments, operational responsibilities, and the security arrangements that were essential for protecting classified assets from compromise or discovery. As evening approached and emergency services confirmed that tornado damage had made roads impassable until morning, Dr. Walsh's extended stay at the Morrison property was creating opportunities for more detailed examination of Robert Morrison's construction work and the locked storage areas that Harold had mentioned. Her federal expertise was providing Harold with new perspectives on his family history, while her questions about structural features and storage systems were encouraging more systematic examination of property areas that might contain federal materials or architectural features that reflected Robert Morrison's true background and activities. The power outage that occurred at 7:23 p.m., caused by tornado damage to electrical systems throughout Henderson County, had forced Harold and Dr. Walsh to use flashlights and emergency lighting to continue their examination of the property and their conversation about Robert Morrison's construction techniques. The loss of electric lighting had actually improved their ability to notice structural details and construction features that were less obvious under normal lighting conditions, while the emergency situation had created additional motivation for understanding the capabilities and resources that Robert Morrison had built into their property design. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Walsh said, as they used flashlights to examine the barn construction more carefully, "the precision engineering and construction techniques that I can see in this lighting suggest building methods that were quite advanced for typical agricultural operations during the 1980s. Your father obviously had access to construction knowledge and specialized expertise that exceeded what most farmers would have possessed during that period." The detailed examination of barn areas that Dr. Walsh was conducting was beginning to reveal construction features that Harold had never noticed or considered significant, including variations in the foundation work, timber framing techniques that seemed to create concealed spaces, and environmental control systems that appeared more sophisticated than typical tobacco storage and processing would require. Dr. Walsh's questions and observations were encouraging Harold to examine his property with the systematic approach that her federal training had taught her to use for facility assessment and security analysis. Dr. Walsh's federal expertise in classified facility assessment was beginning to recognize architectural features that suggested purposes beyond typical agricultural operations, and her examination was revealing construction techniques and security arrangements that were consistent with federal intelligence preservation facilities that had been established throughout rural America during the Cold War period. Her professional training had taught her to recognize indicators of federal involvement, and she was beginning to suspect that the Morrison property might contain features that had been designed for classified storage and security operations. The breakthrough discovery occurred at 9:48 p.m. when Dr. Walsh's systematic examination of the barn's foundation revealed construction details that unmistakably indicated the presence of concealed access mechanisms that had been designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding construction while providing entry to areas that were not visible from the main barn space. Her federal experience with intelligence preservation facilities had taught her to recognize the specific construction techniques that were used for creating secure access to classified storage areas that needed to remain undetected during routine facility use and security inspections. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Walsh said, her voice reflecting both professional excitement and careful federal protocol. I believe your father built concealed access systems in this barn that are consistent with federal intelligence preservation facilities. The construction techniques and security. The conversation about Robert Morrison's construction techniques and design choices had naturally led to discussions about other aspects of the property that might reflect unusual features or federal involvement. Dr. Walsh's professional training in federal facility assessment and her expertise in covert operations had created interest in any architectural details, construction features, or family papers that might provide insights into Robert Morrison's background and activities during his decades of operating what had appeared to be a conventional farming operation. Dr. Walsh, Harold said, Robert Morrison was obviously a man who planned carefully and built things to last, but he never talked much about his background before coming to Kentucky or his knowledge of construction and engineering techniques that seem quite advanced for typical farming applications. After he died in 2019, I inherited not only the farm, but also areas of the barn that he had always kept locked and said contained family papers and business records that required protection from moisture and unauthorized access. Dr. Walsh's federal training had taught her that valuable intelligence materials were often preserved in unexpected locations, and that careful examination of buildings, storage areas, and rural properties could reveal documents, artifacts, or construction features that provided insights into federal operations and classified activities that had not been recorded in obvious places. Her professional expertise encouraged systematic investigation of historical sites that might contain undiscovered materials of federal significance. Historical documents and classified materials from that era were often stored in locations that provided protection from environmental hazards and unauthorized access, Dr. Walsh explained, her professional training now fully engaged with what could be a significant federal discovery. Federal personnel involved in classified programs during the Cold War were particularly careful about preserving documentation that proved their assignments, operational responsibilities, and the security arrangements that were essential for protecting classified assets from compromise or discovery. As evening approached and emergency services confirmed that tornado damage had made roads impassable until morning, Dr. Walsh's extended stay at the Morrison property was creating opportunities for more detailed examination of Robert Morrison's construction work and the locked storage areas that Harold had mentioned. Her federal expertise was providing Harold with new perspectives on his family history, while her questions about structural features and storage systems were encouraging more systematic examination of property areas that might contain federal materials or architectural features that reflected Robert Morrison's true background and activities. The power outage that occurred at 7:23 p.m., caused by tornado damage to electrical systems throughout Henderson County, had forced Harold and Dr. Walsh to use flashlights and emergency lighting to continue their examination of the property and their conversation about Robert Morrison's The Nazi intelligence documents that filled Robert Morrison's storage systems included captured materials from German military intelligence, SS intelligence services, and Nazi research programs that documented German espionage operations conducted within the United States during World War II. These files contained information about German agent networks, American collaborators, and intelligence operations that had been conducted throughout the United States during the period when German intelligence services had been attempting to gather strategic information about American military production and scientific research. The Soviet espionage materials that Robert Morrison had preserved included documents and evidence that had been gathered by American intelligence services during the immediate post-war period when the United States and Soviet Union had been competing for German scientific assets and intelligence capabilities. These materials documented Soviet intelligence operations within the United States and provided insights into Cold War espionage activities that remained classified due to their potential impact on contemporary intelligence operations and diplomatic relationships. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Walsh said as she examined the extraordinary intelligence archive that Robert Morrison had preserved, "these materials represent some of the most significant intelligence assets in American history. If these documents are authentic and complete, your father was protecting classified materials that could be worth tens of millions of dollars to the federal government and essential for understanding some of the most important intelligence operations of the 20th century. The federal assessment that Dr. Walsh conducted of Robert Morrison's intelligence archive was revealing that his preservation work had been far more significant and valuable than typical classified storage operations. The systematic approach and professional quality preservation techniques suggested that Robert Morrison had been conducting intelligence preservation activities that were essential for federal agencies responsible for protecting America's most sensitive historical and contemporary intelligence capabilities. The emergency telephone call that Dr. Walsh placed to Federal Emergency Services at 11:32 p.m. initiated a sequence of events that would bring national security officials, intelligence historians, and federal preservation specialists to the Morrison property with an urgency and scope that reflected the extraordinary significance of Robert Morrison's intelligence legacy. Dr. Walsh's preliminary report to her federal supervisors about the discovery of a comprehensive intelligence preservation facility had triggered emergency protocols for handling discoveries of national security significance. The federal response to Dr. Walsh's report began arriving at the Morrison property at 6:15 a.m., when a convoy of federal vehicles and specialized preservation equipment approached Harold's farm with the kind of operational efficiency and security protocols that reflected the extraordinary sensitivity of materials that required immediate expert analysis and protection from potential security threats. The convoy included National Archives preservation specialists, CIA historical analysis experts, and FBI security personnel whose expertise in intelligence material assessment made them essential for properly evaluating Robert Morrison's archive. The leader of the federal response team was Director Michael Stevens of the National Archives Special Access Programs Division, a 26-year veteran of intelligence preservation who had specialized in World War II and Cold War intelligence materials throughout his federal career. Director Stevens' preliminary briefing about the Morrison property discovery had convinced him that Robert Morrison's intelligence archive represented one of the most significant intelligence preservation discoveries in recent American history, with potential implications for understanding historical intelligence operations, while identifying contemporary assets that remained valuable for federal agencies. Mr. Morrison, Director Stevens said, as federal specialists began establishing secure analysis facilities at Harold's property, your father's intelligence preservation work appears to represent one of the most successful civilian intelligence operations in American history. The preliminary assessment that Dr. Walsh has provided suggests that Robert Morrison protected classified materials that could be invaluable for contemporary intelligence operations and historical research that has been impossible due to the loss or classification of essential source materials. The systematic analysis of Robert Morrison's intelligence archive that federal specialists conducted during the following week exceeded all expectations about the scope and significance of materials that had been preserved in rural Kentucky. The combination of Robert Morrison's detailed preservation work, original historical documents, and comprehensive organizational systems provided insights into American intelligence capabilities that revolutionized federal understanding of World War II and Cold War operations, while identifying contemporary assets that required immediate attention from national security agencies. The economic assessment of Robert Morrison's intelligence archive was conducted by Dr. Patricia Martinez, a senior analyst from the National Archives Appraisal and Assessment Office, who specialized in determining the financial and historical value of intelligence materials for federal acquisition and preservation programs. Dr. Martinez's preliminary assessment indicated that Robert Morrison's archive contained intelligence materials that were worth approximately $47 million to federal agencies, based on their historical significance, contemporary relevance, and the costs that would be required to obtain equivalent intelligence through current collection operations. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Martinez explained during her briefing about the economic value of Robert Morrison's archive, intelligence materials of this historical significance and preservation quality are extraordinarily rare and valuable for federal agencies that need to understand historical operations and identify contemporary intelligence opportunities. The comprehensive nature and exceptional condition of your father's archive makes it invaluable for contemporary intelligence analysis and strategic planning that depends on historical context and operational precedents. The federal government's compensation offer for acquiring Robert Morrison's intelligence archive was presented to Harold Morrison on September 8, 2024, by Director Stevens and Dr. Martinez, who explained that the National Archives and the CIA were authorized to provide immediate compensation of $32 million for exclusive federal access to Robert Morrison's materials, followed by annual consultation fees of $2.8 million for Harold's cooperation with ongoing analysis and research projects that would require his assistance and continued access to the Morrison property. Mr. Morrison, Director Stevens explained, the intelligence materials that your father preserved represent federal assets that are essential for America's intelligence capabilities and understanding historical operations that affect contemporary national security planning. The federal government's compensation reflects both the extraordinary value of these materials and our appreciation for your family's contribution to American intelligence preservation and national security. But the compensation from federal agencies was only the beginning of Harold's economic transformation. The discovery of Robert Morrison's intelligence archive had attracted the attention of the Smithsonian Institution, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and major universities whose historians and researchers were eager to access intelligence materials that could revolutionize understanding of World War II intelligence operations and Nazi espionage activities within the United States. The licensing agreements that Harold Morrison signed with federal agencies and research institutions not only provided immediate resolution to his family's financial crisis, but established the Morrison property as a permanent federal intelligence research facility that would be supported by government funding while remaining under his family's ownership and management. The agreements included provisions for college education funding and career opportunities, ensuring that Harold's agricultural heritage would be preserved while his family's economic security was permanently established through their contribution to American intelligence preservation. The transformation of the Morrison property from struggling family farm to federal intelligence research facility attracted national media attention that highlighted both the extraordinary historical discovery and Harold's inspiring story of financial crisis transformed into economic security and national service. Harold Morrison's interviews with major news networks emphasized his amazement at Robert Morrison's hidden legacy while expressing gratitude for federal recognition and compensation that had saved not only their farm, but provided opportunities for contributing to American intelligence capabilities and historical understanding. The ongoing research at the Robert Morrison Intelligence Research Institute continued to reveal new insights into American intelligence capabilities and historical operations that influence contemporary national security policies and strategic planning. The detailed analysis of Robert Morrison's archive provided information about historical intelligence techniques and preservation methods that remained relevant for understanding contemporary intelligence collection opportunities and developing effective approaches to classified material protection. 3 years after the discovery of Robert Morrison's intelligence archive, the Morrison property had become an internationally recognized center for intelligence history research and preservation analysis, hosting conferences and research programs that attracted scholars and intelligence professionals from universities and government agencies throughout the world. The Institute's research contributions had influenced academic understanding of intelligence operations, while providing practical insights that enhanced contemporary intelligence capabilities and historical preservation techniques. The transformation of Harold Morrison's life from struggling farmer facing foreclosure to guardian of one of America's most significant intelligence discoveries represented one of the most dramatic personal reversals in recent American history. But Harold's response to his changed circumstances reflected the values and perspectives that had been shaped by generations of farming families who understood that extraordinary opportunities carried responsibilities to family, community, and national service. The story of how a desperate farmer's last hope for saving his family farm led to the discovery of intelligence materials worth $47 million became legendary throughout Kentucky and the intelligence community, inspiring other families to investigate their own family histories while demonstrating how individual preservation efforts and federal cooperation could contribute to national security and historical understanding in ways that exceeded anyone's expectations. America's intelligence training programs now include curriculum about the Robert Morrison discovery as an example of how civilian cooperation and federal preservation efforts contributed to American intelligence capabilities while maintaining operational secrecy and community integration. The story serves as inspiration for intelligence professionals while demonstrating the importance of long-term preservation planning and understanding the complex legacies that intelligence operations have contributed to American national security and historical understanding. Today, the Morrison property continues to operate as both an active intelligence research facility and a working demonstration of agricultural heritage preservation, proving that historical research and contemporary intelligence work can coexist with family values and community connections. The Morrison family's story provides a model for how extraordinary discoveries can be transformed into opportunities that benefit not only individual families, but contribute to national security and intelligence preservation. The legacy of Robert Morrison's intelligence preservation work and the discovery of his hidden archive continues to influence America's understanding of intelligence capabilities and civilian contributions to national security. While the Morrison family's cooperation with federal research demonstrates how individual citizens can contribute to protecting America's interests while preserving their family heritage and community connections. In the end, the story of how Harold Morrison's financial crisis led to the discovery of his father's extraordinary intelligence legacy proves that sometimes our greatest challenges create the circumstances that reveal our most valuable assets, and that the combination of family preservation efforts, professional expertise, and federal cooperation can unlock treasures that exceed our most optimistic dreams, while contributing to causes that benefit entire nations and future generations. The tornado that had threatened to destroy Harold Morrison's last hope for saving his family farm instead became the catalyst for discoveries that would secure his family's future, while revealing that their simple tobacco barn had been home to one of America's most important intelligence preservation operations, whose hidden contributions to national security would finally receive the recognition and appreciation that Robert Morrison's extraordinary service had deserved for over 5 decades. What family secrets might be waiting in your inherited property? Like and subscribe for more incredible discovery stories that prove ordinary families can make extraordinary contributions to their communities and their nation's security. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.